Okay, so then I will start now. Okay,
Okay.
okay, thank you very much for coming. And it is a great honor for me to have Professor Jennifer Weisenfeld as a speaker for our project relations today. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd like to introduce briefly. Jennifer Weisenfeld is a professor in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies at Duke University. Her field of research is modern and contemporary Japanese art history, design, and visual culture. So she has a number of books and essays publication, including Mavo, Japanese Artist, and Avant-Garde from 1905 to 1931, published by University of California Press in 2002, and recent book, Imaging Disaster, Tokyo and the Visual Culture of Japan's Great Earthquake of 1923, which is published by University of California Press in 2012. So actually this is translated into Japanese and then published by Seidosha. I have a copy of this, so if you are interested, you can have a Japanese version as well. This book examines how visual culture has mediated the historical understanding of Japan's worst national disaster of 20th centuries. So I suppose she will talk about the relation between the disaster and visuality based on her research on 1923 earthquake and compare it to the current situation. Okay, thank you very much. Jennifer, so can you start talk?
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Mori-san. It's lovely to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to revisit some of these questions in relation to all kinds of disasters, including the pandemic. I know we'll be talking about that a little bit. So I'll just present a little bit and then we'll have a discussion. The relationship between disaster and visuality is a topic that has preoccupied me as an art historian for many years now. And as anyone who has lived or worked in areas along the Pacific Rim, Ring of Fire knows, natural disasters are an ever-present and permanent part of that region's visual culture. But having spent years researching the devastating 7.9 magnitude earthquake that flattened Tokyo and surrounding areas in 1923, killing over 100,000 people, perhaps I'm a bit more fixated on this topic than most people. Then on March 11th, my text went up. Then on March 11th, 2011, when an unprecedented 9.0 magnitude earthquake hit off the coast of Tohoku, the northeastern region of Japan, followed by hundreds of strong aftershocks, we were all reminded once again of modern humanity's fragility in the face of nature. Not only did the quake produce another massive tsunami that washed away the coastline, but also, like its 1923 predecessor, it generated a torrent of images that saturated the visual field. And since I was already deep into writing my book, Imaging Disaster, which was, as you mentioned, was published by the University of California Press in 2012, and was thinking about the ways in which visual images mediate our vision and understanding of disasters, this new event offered fascinating and disturbing echoes of the earlier earthquake. And I had only to view a sampling of the work of contemporary photojournalists to see the recurrence of iconic imagery from previous catastrophes, dramatically spiked seismograms, spectacular scenes of destruction, aerial vistas of widespread devastation, the earth violently fractured, grieving and contemplative figures in a sea of ruins, the wounded objects of daily life, and we'll come back to that a little bit later, and rows of anonymous bodies, which ironically are now sanitized by more stringent press taboos than there were in 1923, when bodies were very much in evidence and on display. And lastly, beseeching message boards in search of missing loved ones, which was something that really resonated with me, these names of people who had been carried off by the tsunami, and the same with 23, these images of missing loved ones on message boards. This compelling visual lexicon of disaster was enduring and undeniable. So this brought up a number of critical questions for me. How do these thousands of images of ruined landscapes and graphic representations of death and destruction act on us to evoke emotions or to provoke action? Is there an aesthetics of disaster that produces certain kinds of affect or constructs a mode of looking? How do these images reinscribe or rearticulate other historical catastrophic events for Japan, such as the Asia-Pacific War or Japan's experience of the atomic bomb? What happens to images that, like people, are orphaned by disaster? And what are the various and new modalities of looking and seeing through and with disaster images in the 20th and 21st centuries? We must continue to probe these questions, especially in this current age of a global pandemic when we are hearing about death daily but rarely seeing it, when a virus invisible to the naked eye threatens our existence, and we are all socializing at a distance with enigmatic face coverings or socializing remotely through digitally mediated platforms that have their own distinctive visuality, like Zoom. There is certainly a pandemic visuality that we need to consider. And without a doubt, the producers and purveyors of disaster images or pandemic images consciously or unconsciously stake a claim to a particular meaning for these events and images. And they communicate this meaning to us through both form and content. Most importantly, disasters provide opportunities for individuals, societies, and nations to articulate their diverse agendas for urban, social, political, or moral reform. And I just underscore that again, that disasters are opportunities. There's an expression, never waste a good crisis. And I think that's something that's really important. We have to constantly think about how disasters provide opportunities. After a disaster, everyone is a critic, even when that criticism is couched in the collectivist rhetoric of national resilience. The striking similarities between criticisms in 1923 and 2011, with accusations of political ineptitude and malfeasance and comments about the moral turpitude of modern society or the pitfalls of technological hubris, reveal powerful parallels between the past and the present. We are hearing similar things in the US now about COVID response. And despite claims of a shared national trauma, when disaster strikes, inequitable social structures and economic development policies expose certain members of the populace to greater risk and suffering than others. Like the unfortunate victims of the 1923 Tembler, who were disproportionately from the poorer neighborhoods of Tokyo, the low city, the Shitamachi. Tohoku residents have suffered more from the 2011 mega disaster because of historical class and regional inequities. We are certainly seeing this in the disproportionate effect of the pandemic on people of color, which is an important truth being communicated by the BLM movement and its global allies. And we know for certain that the reason that there is a nuclear reactor in the Tohoku region and the depopulation of the Tohoku region are symptoms of different kinds of regional inequities. In 1923, the fundamental power of the Japanese nation state ultimately defined the earthquake experience as a national triumph against adversity that produced the gleaming new Tokyo metropolis. The 2011 triple disaster is in many ways still unfolding even nearly 10 years later, so we do not know yet what the master narrative of the event will be, particularly with the added horrific element of nuclear radiation contamination and the global impact on food security. Similarly, being in the midst of the pandemic, we don't yet know what its dominant narrative will be. But what we do know is that whatever the triggering event, natural or human, all disasters have aspects that are man-made, and all disasters are mediated to produce motivated narratives. So we cannot simply say or divide what is a natural and what is a man-made disaster. So with empathy and compassion for those who have lived through these tragic events, and we don't want to lose that part of it, and a deep awareness of the trials and opportunities they pose, I can only offer some partial thoughts about how we might think about disaster and its afterlives through images. Several years ago in 2015, I had the privilege of moderating a panel on the theme of disaster and vision at the New York Public Library in an event with curators from the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, who had curated the exhibition In the Wake. It was the first exhibition in Japan or Euro-America to explore the individual responses of photographers to the 311 triple disaster. This exhibition included work by 17 artists, such as the world-renowned photographers Araki Nobuyoshi, Kawada Kikuji, and Hatakeyama Naoya, and the emerging talents of Shiga Rieko and Arai Takashi. The MFA curators of the exhibition, Anne Nishimura-Morse and Anne Havinga, as well as the amazing photographer Hatakeyama Naoya himself, spoke compellingly about this work. And during the panel conversation, David Odo, Harvard Art Museum's director of academic and public programs and a visual anthropologist of photography, addressed the important question of difficult images and their ubiquity. And as he pointedly noted, however difficult images are, we actively seek them out, whether it is on the internet or elsewhere, ranging from pornography to war atrocities. These images are inescapable, and sometimes they are invoked intentionally to shock viewers into awareness and incite action. Odo called this mobilization through visualization. And interestingly, in the course of my research on earthquakes, I came across the work of US historian Kevin Rosario, who illuminated a similar phenomenon related to the American Red Cross 100 years earlier. Despite the high moral values of this kind of charitable humanitarian organization like the American Red Cross, which of course is now the International Red Cross and we have, has globalized, and these groups saw their activities as standing among the highest achievements of civilization. They achieved their phenomenal fundraising successes because of their active use of sensationalistic mass culture that manipulated people's emotions and was often indistinguishable from mass entertainment. The goal of their individual fundraisers was to, quote, to inspire the noblest sentiments of the men and women assembled before the fundraiser, describing incidents of violence and suffering to appall and shock them into acts of responsible compassion. I love that quote. This tendency to show difficult images, ones that vividly display violence and suffering, as a means of appalling and shocking us into acts of responsible compassion, is a recurrent inclination. And we need to unpack that a bit. The use of mass media to inculcate sympathy, empathy, and compassion to generate aid has continued to escalate, expanding in global scope and scale into the new millennium. As a result, this has produced what some have termed compassion fatigue. And some critics have asked whether this constant exhibition, this constant present apocalyptic reality actually continues to shock us into action, or whether it instead produces a kind of cognitive dissonance, a kind of not looking as a method of coping. Undoubtedly, viewers dealing with the contemporary onslaught of media clutter, while they are heirs to the potent visual legacy of the early 20th century and that historical lexicon of disaster, are dealing with a level of information and saturation from the 24/7 news cycle that is on an entirely different scale, really exponentially larger and more overwhelming. What I found in my research on the 1923 earthquake was an avid acquisition of Kanto earthquake-related news and memorabilia that expressed a deep-seated desire among the general populace to possess and personalize the experience rather than merely inure themselves to the emotional impact of the event. And the pursuit of direct earthquake experience among collateral survivors in response to quake images speaks to a strong need for immediate eyewitness encounters to embody the somatic experience rather than to make it more palatable at a distance. Image production and consumption were an essential part of the coping process after disaster. And I wonder if one could say the same thing about images responding to 3/11 or COVID. The ethics of making and seeing, consuming photographs of disaster, trauma, and now the pandemic will always be problematic because these actions inevitably exploit the situation while bearing witness to it, sometimes reproducing the trauma itself. But communicating survival and resilience are also important aspirations inherent in disaster image making. Again, art and visual culture can serve as a form of coping mechanism. As Susan Sontag observed in Regarding the Pain of Others in the context of war photographs of Sarajevo, victims are interested in the representation of their own sufferings, but they want the suffering to be seen as unique. Disaster images produce a tension between the universal and the particular, the collective and the individual experience. And again, as David Odo described, an interesting phenomenon happened after the 3/11 disaster of found and orphaned photographs. there were about 750,000 photographs retrieved in the wake of the disasters by the Japanese self-defense forces and others that were cleaned and digitized. About 4,000 pictures were actually returned to their owners. But these volunteers soon realized that many pictures were too severely damaged to be returned and placed these photographs in what they called the hopeless box. And out of this was created the Lost and Found Project that has exhibited these orphaned photographs to raise awareness and money for the recovery. I had the privilege of seeing a selection of these lost and found images at the Japan Society in New York City. They were deeply moving because as wounded images, they stand in for the wounded and dead bodies of the people who owned them, many swept out to sea and never recovered. So going back to some of those tropes of the wounded object as a kind of wounded body, as a surrogate. Images can serve as surrogates for human physical and psychic pain, the destruction of family, the obliteration of daily life. And they can help us as survivors process those experiences and memories through their sheer existence. Thank you.
Jennifer, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. Actually, well, there are a lot of, kind of point I want to talk about. And also, I just realized how, art, how important art is, particularly after the, that kind of traumatic experience, like earthquake or COVID-19 or even the war or whatever. So I think it's very important, discussion to look up the kind of relation between art and this traumatic disaster. And also, maybe it's also related to the sort of personal experience, and also the collective memory, how they are related to each other, or even art and politics today. So, well, one of the things I was impressed is that you talked about the Lost and Found project. I think you saw in that exhibition, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, I haven't seen that exhibition, but I actually when I went to the Fukushima, I saw some volunteer working on the project, and that was I at the first I didn't understand what they're doing, and they explained to me, and then I was so moved, how nice it is, and actually this is a very very emotional moment for me. But to be honest, I completely forgot about the project until you talked about today. So thank you very much for kind of reminding me of the project. And also, you write that all disaster may have created their own master narrative, like earthquake in 1923. And then you write, I mean, we haven't seen any master narrative yet about earthquake 2011, or of course the COVID-19. Probably Japanese government wanted to make a narrative by putting the success of 2020 Tokyo Olympics as the end of the story. But obviously, we haven't seen Olympics yet, so we don't have any narrative yet. In fact, the thing is that the government actually declared a state of emergency in 2011, I mean, just after the earthquake, but since then, they haven't declared end of the state of emergency. So the state of emergency still going on since then. And also the crisis of the nuclear power plant or contamination problem are one of them. But in fact, there are a series of natural disaster like typhoon or earthquake, and now we have a COVID-19. So in a way, the state of emergency is becoming a kind of normal condition now. So this is the situation. That's why probably we cannot have any master narrative yet.
That's a really excellent point about this, the bleeding of one disaster and state of emergency into another, where you never really step out of it. You're always on high alert. You're always in peril in some way. And I wonder if that actually was our normal state before, but now through media and through this constant reporting, and also through the national community, because these were regional things up until you had a national press, that now we're experiencing everything equally all the time. And so we'll never step out of these things. It's like going to war. You're always there, even when you have they never end. You're always leaving forces behind. There's never a clear bracketing of events anymore. And that's really problematic when you think about putting a population on high alert all the time. The stress is tremendous. And in terms of the political ramifications and master narratives, it enables certain kinds of nationalist resurgences and other types of discourses, reactionary discourses that we're seeing also around the world. So, it's both stressful and also has political implications, long-term political implications. Yeah.
That's right. Then, okay, so yeah, that's true. So I think, can I start one question? I mean, the first question is, about difference between 1923 earthquake and 2011 earthquake in terms of media. The earthquake in 2011 was the first disaster we experienced through social media like Twitter or Facebook. So in a way, I remember that we are completely surrounded by thousands of fragmented images in the social media. That was really kind of not only it's really mentally, damaging our way of life. That was my experience. But on the other hand, in a way that the earthquake, I mean, the Tohoku earthquake did not produce a national narrative or collective narrative in a way, but it is because this is related to a speed of the consumption of media images. In social media, we too quickly consume the old media and then forget it, what happened. So it's very difficult to keep the old memories in your head, and then it's. So the question is, the cycle of the question is much faster than conventional modern mass media like TV, newspaper, or of course even films. So do you have any idea the kind of difference between the media's mass media or films, newspapers, TVs, and social media, particularly digital media, which are much more fragmented and quickly consumed?
That's an excellent question. I think in many ways, those two modes of communication or dissemination parallel and continue in parallel. So you still have the conventional news media, you still have professional photojournalists who are taking photographs, and in many ways their skill and their ability to disseminate information through these trusted and widely disseminated press outlets still dominates and ends up being the collective memory or becomes the iconic and canonical images. But at the same time, you have this kind of bubbling up of social media that's very, not only constant, very individual, giving texture from individual voices, but it's very ephemeral. And it's, like you said, the pace is so fast, it's not codified, it's kind of immediate and raw, and it disappears so quickly. And one of the interesting phenomena about this is people have been really concerned about how to preserve those. How do you archive social media and things that are digitally born? And Harvard, I know, started a digital archive for the 3/11 catastrophe for that, precisely that reason, to save only digitally born news and social media coverage of the event in order to create another historical archive that would parallel the standard kind of archive. And they've been working assiduously on that. And I think that's really important too, because ephemerality tends to mean forgetfulness. People, once something disappears from your consciousness, and if it hasn't been archived, archives are our memory. If it hasn't been saved or archived, it disappears. And then we can't retrospectively evaluate it. And that's what people do a year, 2 years later. And one of the things that I found with the 1923 earthquake is that people were immediately trying to retrospectively codify and reevaluate and put meaning on the earthquake. And at first, in the first month or two, or even the first 6 months, it's a pretty disparate group of voices. The voices are actually multivalent, different class and even gender types of responses, but over time, those voices narrow. And the official version in the state, because the state is much more powerful in the 20s than it is now in many ways, because it does control and is very much dictating the national press. But still there's tension there. And so there's this constant effort to codify, whether it's on the first annual anniversary, then the second annual anniversary. And then in 1930, there is actually a declaration that Tokyo has been reconstructed, and that reconstruction and the earthquake has officially ended. They actually announced that it has officially ended, and they put meaning on what that experience was. And that meaning is that it was a national triumph of resilience in the face of disaster. And watching that historically unfold, we have to understand that rather than just saying, oh, well, that is really the meaning. As a historian, I want to go back through the layers of that codification. And hopefully, if we archive social media, we can do that as well, and we'll still see those multivalent voices. And it can't just be voices that are about emotions or immediacy, because we always have that, the immediacy, the difference between the macro view and the micro view from the individual, but actually diversified experiences of the earthquake that are in tension with a state idea of benevolence, for instance. Maybe the state is benevolent, and that's a really important part of it as well. So I do think it's incredibly valuable, but I don't think the previous mode of national news coverage has been displaced at all. I think it dominates.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, maybe this is related to the question about artist response, because artist obviously has their own individual kind of expression, and it's much more personal than public or state narrative, right? And you mentioned the sort of exhibition, and one of the important photographers, Hatakeyama Naoya, and he is definitely the central figure in the exhibition. Particularly, he's very important. But at the same time, actually, I also heard his presentation and his story and family story about it. It's very, I feel very emotional after hearing the presentation. But having said that, if you look at his artworks, it's not that emotional in a way. I mean, he tried to kind of catch very quiet landscape after the earthquake, and or I don't know what's the best way, but he tried to not to be emotional when he's taking photo, or when looking at the kind of emerging artists like Shiga Eriko. She's also kind of take a picture of local communities in the area, but also she tried to, somehow non-emotional, not sensational, not emotional. In a way, I think these artists doesn't want to sort of make a direct expression to express their mourning. How do you think this? It's these kind of artist behavior when they face sort of really personal tragedy?
Well, to me, it definitely brings up the question of, can you ever represent disaster accurately? I don't think there's ever a total representation of it. And the sensationalistic representations, the graphic representations, are one way of getting at it, but they don't get at everything. And we tend to believe in the myth of photography, the myth of truth, that it is representing everything, but it doesn't. It's only partial. Every medium is partial in how it represents it. And what I see with the artist's response, particularly Hatakeyama, because he lost his mother in the tsunami, is a kind of quiet mourning and affect. He's going for the somatic affective response of emptiness, of lack, of places that are familiar, that are no longer there, the places of his boyhood, his childhood. and his home, and he's trying to create a kind of almost everydayness. It's the banality of it, that it's these everyday places that are just no longer there, that have that were nostalgic, that are now traumatic for him, that get at the emotional register of loss that any image of a dead body cannot do. Because it's a deeper, longer, abiding kind of emotional response. And the same way with other types of artists who are trying to get at the radioactive aspect or things that are invisible. This is the problem. Disaster is both a visible and an invisible type of phenomenon. It affects you on an emotional level, and this disaster had invisible components of radioactivity that we are still grappling with, and yet you can't see them. And that makes it so difficult to represent in a visual medium. I saw a wonderful presentation a couple of years ago about an artist or a group that was bagging up contaminated soil from Fukushima and creating these enormous walls, these mounds of hefty bags, of big garbage bags filled with contaminated soil, to give you a visual cue to the scale of contamination, because otherwise you really couldn't see it. And that ways in which you're just displacing earth and bagging it up and showing what has been contaminated was another way. So I think the artists are really struggling with what is not seen, what is felt. And also the resilient activist side, which is, why did this happen? Why did this happen here? There are groups that are trying to do in a much more kind of socially engaged artistic practice, where they're doing grassroots organizations and trying to mobilize the population, because they don't want the people in Tohoku to be victimized a second time. I think there's lots of ways in which artistic intervention provides many levels of insight that the press or a photograph can't in its conventional way.
Yeah, I think this is related to the sort of shift of the forms of art itself, because recently the artists are more engaged with sort of social activity rather than just producing the images. So like, artists used to be a painter or sculptor or this kind of someone who create images, but nowadays they are becoming more kind of socially engaged. Art is one of the examples, but they try to be engaged in a more social practice, which is not really invisible to society. And particularly after the earthquake, I mean, there are many artists who did that kind of social activities rather than making art itself.
And getting out of the gallery, getting out of the standard spaces of art, which are elite spaces, and people have been critiquing that for decades and decades. But it's really imperative when you're dealing with people who are on the periphery or a perceived periphery, that you go to those spaces and that your art intervene in that locale versus trying to exploit the disaster back in the spaces of elite culture. And that's something, of course, it's important that people everywhere see these things, but if the people who are affected by it, any interaction, they don't have any voice in this process, then you can be exploitative. You have to be very careful. There's this phenomenon of disaster capitalism that people talk about, and artists can be part of that, intentionally or unintentionally.
And the irony of that COVID-19, I mean, is, people cannot be social anymore. I mean, you have to keep a distance all the time. So many artists who become activists have to change their strategy. They cannot be social. They have to keep a distance from anyone. So it's interesting moment again that what artists can do, after this COVID-19 pandemic. Probably artists have to stay at home and maybe make some images and circulate it through internet or something. I don't know what's the next one.
Well, we're seeing in the US, and I think actually globally, we're seeing two extreme responses, which is socially distanced interaction through mediated screens like Zoom and FaceTime and other things. And then we're seeing this incredible, visceral, on the streets protest movement that's developed with Black Lives Matter and across all allies across the world, And that is very real and very in person. So, and what's interesting is it's doubly risky for the people, both because of the police violence, but also because of their own potential contagion in a pandemic. So you get the stakes are doubly high for the people going out to do that. But then they're going out with masks, many of them. And it kind of brings back images of the Occupy movement where people were wearing masks to anonymize themselves. And one of the interesting things, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's related, is that in these new public protests, like in Hong Kong, for instance, you're seeing masking as both for tear gas and for self-preservation and now for COVID, but also as an attempt to thwart the state from identifying protesters.
Yeah.
Because there is very sophisticated facial recognition software now, which of course is all developed in Hong Kong and mainland China. And they are able to very quickly identify people. So the masking has a really double effect here. It's both, it's preserving people both from disease, from tear gas, and also giving them anonymity in a moment where they could be very much at risk and vulnerable from state violence. So we're seeing some really interesting moments right now, and I'll be curious to see how it all.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, the Hong Kongese government once tried to ban all masking.
They did?
Yeah, but eventually they failed because of the COVID-19.
I know. That irony. I know. Yeah, and we were seeing all different kinds of masks. First you had the N95s, and then you were seeing the gas masks with the double HEPA filters, and then you were seeing these anonymous masks, the vengeance mask, all kinds of interesting masking. I work a lot on gas mask imagery in relation to the civil air defense movement of World War II, which is a new project I'm publishing right now. And the symbolism of masks in this age has been just absolutely fascinating, really fascinating.
Can you talk about a bit about kind of representation of military force or a police institution during the disaster? Because after the earthquake in 2011, it's kind of in a way that we saw a lot of self-defense force in the TV who are actually saving the people. Right. So they became a kind of hero of the national. So they try to be very friendly. They sometimes organize concerts, but in fact, it's kind of propaganda of self-defense force, GETAI in Japanese. So it's quite ambivalent to me because basically I don't like any military forces. That's kind of more simply political statement. At the same time, yes, as long as they are working for the people, as long as they are saving some people's life, we should appreciate that. That's why I feel kind of ambivalent. But at the same time, I think this is a great opportunity for the military force to present themselves in the mass media. Do you have any idea? And they did very well in that.
And Japan has the added layer of having a constitutional prohibition against having an army, so they have a self-defense force, which is one of the largest militaries in the world. And there's been so much discussion about normalizing the military that you can't help but think that kind of propaganda about benevolent and helpful military self-defense forces would eventually be a tipping point for reinstating the military, which is a big concern in Japan with its wartime history, and people have really pushed back against that. There's definitely a very conscious spin on the representation of the military and also the imperial household during 1923, showing the emperor and his body, making sure that people could see it and make sure that imperial rule was intact, that he was still there, because there was always fear of losing sovereignty. And you have to remember that Japan in 1923 was a burgeoning empire, but it was also very vulnerable to Western imperialism. And there's always this fear of the incursion of Western, in the guise of aid, you could lose your sovereignty to Western power. So there's a lot of fear about being too vulnerable during this time. So showing the emperor, showing the army and various kinds of defense forces coming in and helping was a way of showing that the government was intact. There are lots of images of firemen and local police helping. But on the other hand, after the 23 earthquake, you had a widespread rampage of vigilante violence against Korean colonial subjects living in Japan. I think about 6,000 people were massacred during this time, and a variety of important leftist political figures like Osugi Sakai and other people were murdered by the police. And it became an opportunity to eradicate people who were perceived as seditious or problematic. And so you see a lot of xenophobia and anti-leftist sentiment being realized through police brutality or through police sanctioned brutality in some way. And so that image of benevolence is really mitigated, but there's not a lot of press coverage of that massacre. Pressed, and actually the news has a moratorium on reporting about it. So it kind of gets those deaths get mixed in with the other kind of deaths, and there's not a lot of discussion about it. So ultimately, the image of the police and the military is a positive one of restoration. And because the greatest fear after disaster is chaos. That is the greatest fear. Chaos, dissolution into barbarism. And you hear this a lot about dissolution into barbarism, that when the strictures of society disappear, at least temporarily, that people will become barbaric. And so the need to restore order becomes a really powerful message during those times. So I think I think it's an incredibly important question, and we keep asking it in the new context of every time. The Chinese earthquakes as well, you see the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, also being propagandistically lauded for their activities in saving. In the Sichuan earthquake, a lot of similar images of people being saved and helped. And also that covers up the government complicity and the local municipal government complicity in building shabby buildings that fall down during disasters. So one good government image covers another kind of image.
Okay, so that also related to the kind of the actors of archives, or who is kind of archiving images, or for whom. In a way, normally the archive is made by the government or state or library or the kind of public institution. But at the same time, maybe there should be another type of archives, another type of, collecting images. But
are institutional. That's the nature of them, that they do tend to be institutional, and they tend to be civic. Even if you were having a public library, they're going to have a kind of municipal perspective on how things are gathered and they're curated. So unless you have personal archives or institutions that have an alternative perspective, that memory preservation is going to have a certain kind of hegemonic, more institutional bias to it.
Okay, I think it's nearly time to finish, but can I ask a last question about our project? Relations. The relations is basically, this is a sort of a project for art criticism and also the media practices. Because when we say the art criticism, this is mainly based on the text, essays or literature. But at the same time, we are using new media like this, using Zoom. So probably we can kind of use this kind of technology to make a new type of the criticism. This is one kind of easy proposal, but more difficult proposal is, people basically are not so interested in art criticism these days, particularly in the art world. Maybe the artists or curators or producers or collectors are kind of much more visible than art critics. In the last century, I mean, even the late 1990s, I think art critics were much more active. I mean, try to be, influential on artwork. But these days, I mean, they are nearly giving up, participating in the discussion. I don't know how you think about the kind of role of the art criticism or criticism in general, or even critique in the humanities.
Yes. Well, one of the concerns that we heard when visual studies started to emerge was that if every image and every person producing an image was of equal value in study, that you would have a very precipitous or pretty quick de-skilling of the field. And the concern about expertise, about people who understand the historical context, who understand the critical discursive context of things, would not be there to interpret and provide meaning for various things in that kind of interventionist way, and then everything would become equivocal, everything would be the same. And we're kind of finding that problem with news right now, with this idea of fake news, what's real news, what's alternative news, what's mainstream news. We need trusted interlocutors. We need people who we trust, who we believe provide context and meaning to things for us and help us parse it out, because frankly, even statistics, it's just so hard to understand what information is reliable. I think art critics and critics of all forms, and I mean historians as well, as a form of kind of historiographical criticism, I think interpretive readings is still really important, because we need people who are reliable, who have credentials, who can provide context for understanding things and expertise to help us understand this kind of morass of information that we're trying to process, and who are also transparent about their biases as well. I don't think any neutral or objective position, but it is helpful if you can find people who you understand where they're coming from, and you trust their expertise, and you know that they're doing their best to find reliable information for you. That's a really valuable social role. And it's not so easy. I don't think we're all so visual, and I include myself in this. I don't think I'm so visually literate that I can just take an image or take information and just understand it on the face of it. I don't know if I can do that, especially not in a global setting where I don't know everything about the world. So I need experts and people who are educated and who have steeped themselves in particular areas to provide me with a reliable kind of view on things. And then I can process, still have my own discerning view. But I think it's ever more important that we have reliable people, because just because you write a blog does not make you an expert. And it's just so easy now to have your voice heard, but not all voices are expert voices. And I teach in a university. We train people to have expertise, and I believe in that. I believe in it for science. I don't think anybody's view on science is valuable. I think scientists train, and they have very rigorous standards for what they do, and art critics also have rigorous or should have rigorous standards for what they do. So there is a role for expertise in the future and now.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Originally, this is a part of the Tokyo Biennale 2020, but it was postponed because of COVID-19. So originally, I was planning to invite you to kind of participate in the symposium, but it was lucky. I could use Zoom, and you accepted the offer. Thank you very much indeed. So I hope you.
Sorry, I couldn't come to Tokyo. I would have liked to have been in Tokyo.
Yeah. Actually, the Tokyo Biennale should take place next year. And our
Okay.
project is going on anyway.
Okay. So next
2,
year
3
we'll
years.
meet up.
Yeah, so hope to see you soon.
Okay, great. Take care.
Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.